The day I turned 18, my parents handed me a bill, $500 in rent. No warning, no discussion. Meanwhile, my siblings lived for free, got gifts, and had their college paid for. I worked nonstop just to survive under their roof. Years later, when they begged me for help, I finally made them pay, but not with money. Growing up, I always knew something was different about the way my family treated me. I just didn't understand why. There were 5 of us, my parents, my younger brother Chris, my sister Emily, and me. We weren't rich, but we weren't struggling either. My father worked a steady job as a contractor, and my mother managed a local boutique. We lived in a modest but comfortable 2-story house in a quiet neighborhood. From the outside, we looked like any other middle-class family. People assumed we were close, that we loved each other, that we took care of one another. But the reality inside those walls was different, and I was the only one who seemed to notice. I was the eldest, and in my family, that meant I was responsible for everyone but myself. It started subtly, in ways I didn't think twice about as a child. When I was 8, I was expected to help set the table every night while Chris and Emily got to keep playing. When I was 10, I had to wash the dishes after dinner while they watched cartoons. My mother would say it was because I was older, that it was my job to set a good example. I believed her. By the time I was 12, my responsibilities had doubled. If something needed to be done, I was the one expected to handle it. Cleaning the kitchen, vacuuming the living room, folding laundry, it all fell on me. My parents never even asked Chris or Emily to help. When I finally worked up the courage to ask why, my mother simply sighed and told me, "Because you're the eldest. It's your job to take care of them." And that was the answer to everything. At 14, I became the built-in babysitter. My parents worked late shifts, so every afternoon, I was in charge. I made sure Chris finished his homework. I helped Emily with her school projects. I cooked dinner most nights and made sure they got to bed on time. If they misbehaved, I got in trouble for not watching them properly. If the house was messy, I was the one who had let things get out of control. The worst part was that Chris and Emily knew it. They knew they could get away with anything because, in the end, I would be the one blamed. They learned early that if they whined enough, I would be the one punished. If Chris broke a vase, I got grounded for not keeping an eye on him. If Emily threw a tantrum, I was scolded for not handling things better. It didn't take long for me to realize that in my parents' eyes, I wasn't really their child. I was their third parent. I remember the first time I felt real resentment toward my family. It was my 16th birthday. I didn't expect a party, but I thought, at the very least, they would acknowledge it. That morning, I woke up to the sound of Chris and Emily fighting over who got to pick the movie for family night. My parents were too busy getting ready for work to say anything to me. I waited all day for someone to remember. Dinner came and went. I set the table, just like always. I did the dishes, just like always. By the time I finished cleaning the kitchen, my mother was watching TV, and my father was dozing off in his chair. Chris and Emily were in their rooms, laughing on the phone with their friends. No one said a word. It wasn't until the next day, when I finally broke down and asked my mother if they had forgotten, that she gave me a half-hearted, "Oh, sorry, honey. We've been busy." And that was it. I told myself it didn't matter, that I didn't care. But I did. By 17, I had a part-time job after school, working at a local grocery store to save up for college. Any money I made, I kept hidden in an envelope under my mattress. It was the one thing that was mine, the one thing I could control. Then one day, I came home to find my mother in my room, holding the envelope. She didn't even look guilty when she told me she had borrowed some of it. Just a few $100s. She and my father had needed help covering bills that month. When I tried to protest, she told me that since I lived under their roof, I needed to contribute. When I pointed out that Chris and Emily didn't contribute anything, she just sighed and said, "They're younger. They're not supposed to worry about things like that." I was 17, but apparently, I was supposed to worry. After that, I stopped saving money at home. I opened a bank account and never let them near it. I was tired of feeling like I owed them something just for existing. The day I turned 18, everything changed. And by everything, I mean things got worse. I had barely walked through the front door after my high school graduation when my mother told me that rent was due on the 1st. $500 a month. No warning. No discussion. Just a statement, like it was the most normal thing in the world. I thought she was joking. She wasn't. I asked why. Chris was 16. Emily was 14. They didn't have to pay rent. They didn't even have chores. But according to my parents, none of that mattered. I was an adult now. If I wanted to stay, I had to pay. That was the moment I realized the truth. I had never been their child. Not really. I had been their extra set of hands, their live-in babysitter, their unpaid housekeeper. And now, I was nothing more than a source of income. That night, as I lay in bed, listening to my family laugh in the living room, I knew I would never be one of them. Not in the way Chris and Emily were. Not in the way that mattered. I had spent my entire life taking care of them, but when had they ever taken care of me? I knew then that I had to leave. I just didn't know when, but I would. And when I did, I would never look back. The first time I handed my mother $500 in rent, she didn't even look at me. She took the cash, stuffed it into her purse, and went back to scrolling through her phone like it was nothing. Like I was nothing. That moment defined the next year of my life. I worked every hour I could just to keep up. My grocery store job wasn't enough, so I picked up extra shifts wherever I could. Fast food, stocking shelves at a warehouse, even cleaning offices at night. While my friends talked about college plans and road trips, I spent my days exhausted, my body aching, my mind numb from the endless cycle of work, sleep, and more work. The worst part wasn't even the exhaustion. It was knowing that none of it mattered to them. Chris and Emily continued to live their comfortable, carefree lives. My parents still paid for my brother's gas and car insurance. My sister still got new clothes every month, money for school trips, a bedroom filled with things I had never been allowed to have. One night, after coming home from a 12-hour shift, I found my family sitting in the living room, laughing over takeout from a fancy restaurant. My stomach was empty. I hadn't eaten since my lunch break hours ago, but there was no food left for me. No one had even thought to save me a plate. When I asked, my mother just shrugged. "You're working now. You can buy your own." It wasn't just food. It was everything. When the air conditioning broke in the middle of summer, my parents told me if I wanted it fixed, I could chip in. When Chris needed new shoes for school, my mother spent the money I had just given her for rent. When Emily wanted to take dance lessons, they magically found the funds. I was paying them to be treated like a stranger in my own home. I tried to hold on. I told myself I could save up, that I could leave when the time was right. But that illusion shattered one afternoon when I came home early from work and overheard a conversation that made my blood run cold. I had just stepped inside when I heard my parents talking in the kitchen. My mother was laughing, saying something about how lucky they were to have me covering extra expenses. My father grunted in agreement, then mentioned that with my help, they could finally afford to put aside money for Emily's future. Not mine. Emily's. I froze in the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest. I had spent the last year working myself to the bone, sacrificing every dream I'd ever had just to keep a roof over my head. Meanwhile, my parents had been taking my money and setting it aside for my sister, the child who had never lifted a finger. The child who had never heard the words, "You need to contribute." It all became clear in that moment. I was never part of their future. I was just a tool, something to be used and discarded when they didn't need me anymore. That night, I made my decision. I wouldn't give them another cent. The next time rent was due, I didn't pay. I came home from work, walked past my mother sitting on the couch, and went straight to my room. The silence lasted for about an hour before she knocked on my door, her voice sickeningly sweet as she reminded me that I forgot to give her the rent money. I told her I wasn't paying anymore. For the first time in years, she actually looked at me, not with concern, not with understanding, but with fury. She demanded to know what I meant, acting as if I had just betrayed her in some horrible way. I stood my ground. I told her I had been paying them while my siblings got to live for free. I told her I knew about the money they were setting aside for Emily. I told her I was done. She didn't argue. She didn't try to deny it. She simply crossed her arms and said, "Then you can leave." That was it. No hesitation. No attempt to keep me. My father didn't say a word. Chris and Emily didn't even come out of their rooms. I packed my bags that night. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I didn't even say goodbye. As I stepped outside, duffel bag slung over my shoulder, I heard my mother's voice behind me, cold and sharp. You'll be back. I didn't look back. I didn't come back. I thought leaving my parents' house would bring me peace, but the anger never really left me. It sat in my chest, heavy and bitter, a constant reminder of every sacrifice I had made for a family that had never seen me as their own. I tried to move on, found a small, run-down room to rent, worked every hour I could, told myself I was free. But at night, when exhaustion set in, I couldn't stop replaying everything that had happened. I had always known I was treated differently. I had always felt like an outsider in my own home, but I had never understood why. The answer came from someone I never expected. It had been about 2 months since I left when I got a call from my aunt, my mother's older sister Lisa. We had never been particularly close, but she had always been kinder to me than the rest of my family. When I was a kid, she was the only adult who ever asked how I was doing, who noticed when I was struggling. She never spoke against my parents, but I always felt like she saw the way they treated me. When I answered the phone, her voice was hesitant, almost nervous. She said she had heard I moved out and wanted to check on me. But after a few minutes of small talk, she lowered her voice and said something that sent a chill through my entire body. I think it's time you knew the truth. I didn't breathe. Lisa told me that I wasn't my parents' biological child. They had never told me, never even hinted at it. But the truth was, they had adopted me when I was a baby. For years, my mother and father had struggled to conceive. They had tried everything, doctors, treatments, prayers, until finally, they decided to adopt. That was when they took me in. I had been their only child for almost 4 years, the center of their world. And then, miraculously, my mother got pregnant. Chris was born first. Then, 2 years later, Emily. And just like that, I became an afterthought. Lisa told me she had seen it happen in real time. The way my parents' love shifted. The way their excitement for me faded as their real children came into the picture. She said she had fought with my mother about it, had told her that I deserved the same love and attention as Chris and Emily. But my mother refused to listen. She always saw them as a second chance, Lisa said. And after that, you were just extra. I felt numb. My entire life, I had thought I was just the unlucky eldest, the one expected to take on more responsibility because that's just how families worked. I had told myself that maybe, somehow, I had done something wrong to make them treat me differently. But the truth was simpler. I had never been theirs to love. Suddenly, everything made sense. The way they had always pushed me aside, the way my mother had looked at Chris and Emily like they were everything and looked at me like I was an obligation. The way I had been forced to work, to take care of them, to contribute, while my siblings got to be carefree children. I remembered every birthday they had forgotten, every sacrifice they had expected me to make, every time they had made me feel like I didn't belong. Because I didn't. I was just the child they had taken in before they had real children. And once they had what they truly wanted, I became nothing more than a reminder of their old failures. A burden. A mistake. Lisa apologized for not telling me sooner. She said she had wanted to, but she thought it wasn't her place. I could barely hear her over the sound of my own heartbeat. I thanked her, hung up, and sat in silence for a long time. I didn't cry. I didn't feel sad. I felt free. For the first time in my life, I realized I had never really lost a family, because I had never truly had one. Walking away from my parents' house for the last time felt strange. I had spent my whole life in that place, forced to be the responsible one, the caretaker, the one who always had to sacrifice. But now, I was gone, and for the first time, I wasn't looking back. That night, I booked the cheapest motel I could find. $45 a night for a room that smelled like cigarette smoke and cheap disinfectant. It didn't matter. It was mine. I had barely $1,200 in my bank account, a week's worth of clothes in my duffel bag, and no idea what came next. The first thing I did was block their numbers. Then, I changed mine. I deleted my social media, wiped my accounts clean, and cut every possible tie. I wanted them to know nothing about my life. For the next 3 weeks, I bounced between friends' couches, sleeping on lumpy futons and threadbare carpets, working double shifts to scrape together enough for my own place. I kept my job at the grocery store, but I needed more. So, I hustled. I picked up a second job at a 24-hour diner, working from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., serving coffee and greasy pancakes to truckers and drunks. I smelled like burnt bacon and cheap syrup. My feet ached from standing for 8 hours straight. But the tips, $80 to $100 a night, kept me afloat. During the day, I stocked shelves at the grocery store from 2 p.m. to 10 p.m. That meant, on most days, I only got about 3 or 4 hours of sleep. It didn't matter. Every paycheck, every dollar, was proof that I was surviving without them. By month 2, I had saved enough for a tiny studio apartment, $750 a month, barely big enough to fit a mattress, a folding table, and a second-hand couch I bought off Craigslist for $50. It had peeling wallpaper, an ancient fridge that rattled at night, and a bathroom so small I could touch both walls if I stretched my arms out. But it was mine. I didn't have to answer to anyone. No one could take my money. No one could tell me I owed them. For the first time, I was free. I refused to stay stuck in survival mode. The moment I had enough stability, I started looking for better jobs. After 6 months of working 2 jobs, I landed a full-time position at a logistics company as a warehouse supervisor. It paid $23 an hour, more than double what I made stocking shelves. I quit the diner and the grocery store the same day. With a steady paycheck, I upgraded my life. I moved into a 1-bedroom apartment in a safer neighborhood, $1,100 a month, but worth every penny. I finally bought a car, a used Honda Civic for $4,200, paid in cash after months of aggressive saving. At 21, I had built a life better than anything my parents had given me. I never spoke to them again. For almost 4 years, they were nothing but a bad memory. Then, out of nowhere, my phone lit up with a call from an unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. It was my mother. Her voice was softer than I remembered, hesitant, almost friendly. She wanted to talk. I deleted the message. Then, more messages followed. A text, "Please call me. It's important." An email. A Facebook message from a new account, since I had already blocked her old one. Even a handwritten letter, mailed to my workplace, something I still don't know how she figured out. I ignored them all. Then, one day, I ran into my father. I was sitting in a cafe, finishing up paperwork on my laptop, when I heard my name. I looked up and saw him standing by the door. He looked different, smaller. His clothes were worn, his beard unkempt, his posture slouched. I barely recognized him. He hesitated before walking over, hands stuffed in his jacket pockets. For the first time in my life, I saw something I had never seen in him before. Defeat. He didn't start with an apology. He didn't acknowledge anything he had done. He just sighed and said, "We need your help." I didn't say a word. I just stared at him, waiting. He took a seat across from me, rubbing a hand over his face. "Things have been hard," he admitted. "Work's dried up. Your mother's been sick. Chris lost his job. Emily's struggling." I didn't react. He hesitated before adding, "We could use some support, just something to get us back on our feet." After years of being their burden, suddenly, I was their solution. I finally spoke. "So, what is it you want?" He looked almost relieved that I was listening. "Just a little help. Alone. Alone. After stealing from me. After forcing me to pay rent while Chris and Emily lived for free. After throwing me out like I was nothing." I picked up my coffee, took a slow sip, and let the silence stretch. Then, I set the cup down and met his gaze. "I don't owe you anything." His face twisted. He looked like he wanted to argue, like he wanted to remind me of all they had done for me. But he must have realized how ridiculous that sounded. I reached into my wallet, pulled out a few dollars, and set them on the table between us. Enough to cover his coffee, nothing more. Then I stood up, grabbed my bag, and walked out. I didn't look back. I thought the cease and desist letter would be enough to make them back off. It wasn't. 2 weeks after sending it, I came home to find an envelope taped to my apartment door. At first, I assumed it was another desperate letter from my parents, another attempt to guilt me into giving them money. But when I ripped it open, my stomach dropped. It was a legal notice. My parents were suing me. The document was full of legal jargon, but the claim was simple. They were demanding financial support. They argued that since they had raised me and provided for me until I was 18, I was now obligated to repay them for those years of care. They cited filial responsibility laws, claiming that as their adult child, I had a legal duty to support them now that they were struggling. It was insane. I had heard of cases like this before, parents suing their children for money when they fell on hard times, but it rarely went anywhere. Filial responsibility laws existed in some states, but they were almost never enforced, especially in cases where the parents had financially abused their child. And I had proof of exactly that. The next morning, I met with my lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Rachel. She skimmed through the lawsuit, her expression shifting from confusion to irritation to amusement. "This is a joke," she finally said, tossing the papers onto her desk. "They don't have a case. But since they went through the trouble of filing, we're going to make sure they regret it." We spent the next few weeks gathering everything we needed. Bank records, every rent payment I had made to my parents from the time I turned 18 until the day I moved out, text messages and emails, conversations where my mother outright admitted they had taken my money, spent it on my siblings, and felt I owed them. Witness statements, friends, neighbors, and even my former co-workers who had seen firsthand how my parents treated me. Legal precedents. Other cases where similar lawsuits had been thrown out immediately due to lack of merit. Rachel drafted a brutal response to their claim, laying out every single reason why their case was not only baseless but could potentially backfire on them. Then, we waited. A month later, we were standing in a courtroom. My parents sat across from me, looking smug. My mother had on her usual concerned parent act, sighing dramatically and shaking her head as if she couldn't believe she had to go to court against her own child. My father, arms crossed, stared straight ahead, refusing to meet my eyes. When the judge finally called the case, their lawyers stood and launched into a speech about how they had done their parental duty, sacrificing for me, raising me, and now, in their time of need, I had heartlessly abandoned them. He went on about family obligations, about how it was morally and legally right for me to support them. Rachel let him talk. She didn't interrupt once. Then, when it was her turn, she stood and methodically dismantled every single one of their claims. She presented the bank records showing that I had paid them thousands in rent while they fully supported my siblings. She showed text messages where my mother admitted they had taken my savings for Emily. She introduced witness statements from people who had seen me work 2 jobs just to survive under their roof. And then, she delivered the final blow. "Your Honor," Rachel said, her voice calm but firm, "not only is this case frivolous, but we have clear evidence that the plaintiffs financially exploited my client for years. If they wish to continue pursuing this claim, we are prepared to file a countersuit for financial abuse and fraud." My parents visibly stiffened. Their lawyer looked at them, whispering something urgently. My mother's face turned red. My father clenched his jaw. They had come here thinking they could scare me into paying them. Instead, they had walked into a trap. The judge didn't even need much time to decide. "This case is dismissed," she said, barely glancing at my parents. "There is no legal obligation for the defendant to provide financial support. Additionally, I strongly advise the plaintiffs to reconsider any further action, as it appears they are dangerously close to opening themselves up to legal consequences of their own." That was it. It was over. My parents stormed out of the courtroom without looking at me. Their plan had failed. But I wasn't done yet. Rachel filed a formal complaint against them for attempting to use the legal system to extort money from me. It didn't lead to criminal charges, but it put a permanent mark on their records, one that would make it harder for them to pull this stunt on anyone else. After that, I changed my locks, added extra security to my apartment, and made sure they had no way of reaching me. They thought they could take what was mine. They had no idea who they were dealing with. After the lawsuit, my parents had nothing left. They lost the case, their reputation had taken a hit, and now, they were in worse financial shape than before. I assumed that was the end of it, that they would finally give up and leave me alone. I was wrong. A month after the court ruling, I got an email from an unknown address. The subject line just said, "We need to talk." I almost ignored it, but curiosity got the best of me. When I opened it, I saw a long, rambling message from my mother. She claimed they had hit rock bottom. My father was out of work, they were behind on mortgage payments, and Chris had moved back home after losing his job. Emily was struggling too, unable to pay for school. They were desperate. She didn't apologize. Not once. Instead, she demanded that I step up and do the right thing because I was the only one who could help. The sheer audacity made me laugh. These were the same people who had taken everything from me. My money, my childhood, my dignity. The same people who had thrown me away when I stopped being useful. The same people who had literally tried to sue me for cash. And now they wanted my help? I stared at the screen for a long time, thinking about what to do. I could ignore them completely, block the email, and move on with my life. Or I could make sure they finally felt the consequences of everything they had done. So, I responded. I told my mother that I had helped them, that I had given them years of free labor, thousands of dollars in rent, and every ounce of effort I had. I reminded her that she had chosen to treat me like an outsider, that they had made it clear I was never really part of their family. And then, I said the words I had been waiting my whole life to say. You are nothing to me. Don't contact me again. Then, I hit send, and I never heard from them again. It's been over 2 years since that final email. In that time, I've completely rebuilt my life. I got promoted to a senior management position at work, doubling my salary. I moved into a beautiful condo, fully paid for with my own money. I took my first real vacation, traveling across Europe for a month, something I never thought I'd be able to afford. Most importantly, I found peace. I don't waste energy thinking about my parents. I don't check up on them, and I don't care what happened to them after I cut them off. They made their choices, and now they get to live with them. I'm free, and I'll never let anyone take that away from me again. What do you think? Would you have given them one last chance, or did they get exactly what they deserved? Let me know in the comments.